Hey everyone, great to have you with us today. Today we're looking at Mark chapter 7, verses 1 through 23. So if you want to try to find that, I'm not going to read it, but I'll be referring to it as we go through this. But I want to start today by asking you a question. Who is the most influential person in your life today? And I'm not really talking about somebody from your past or somebody who has made you who you are today, but in your everyday life today. Who would you say has the most influence? Some of you might be thinking, I should say Jesus. But if we're being honest, and if you're like most of us, we would probably have to say the most influential person in your life is you. You talk to yourself more than anyone else talks to you. And when you talk to yourself, you always listen. We believe almost everything we tell ourselves. And we never tell ourselves to be quiet. We're always interpreting everything that happens to us, everything people say to us or what they do to us. We're always interpreting that. That's the power of your heart. Your heart, the way you think, the way that you interpret life is a powerful influence in your life today. And that's what makes your heart so important in worship and in your relationship with God. That's the concept that we learn from Jesus in our passage today. True worship affects your heart. It's not just a set of traditions or rituals. So in the passage that we're looking at in Mark chapter 7 and verses 1 through 5, the Pharisees and the elders come to Jesus with a complaint. Now this is a group of Pharisees and some scribes that have come from Jerusalem to Galilee. Now, most people, right at this time in Mark chapter 7, were actually traveling in the opposite direction. Most people were going to Jerusalem for the Passover season. But these guys traveled almost 100 miles, which would have taken them about 5 days, for the express purpose of picking a fight with Jesus. Now, the first scribe that ever existed was Ezra, back in the Old Testament days. And back then, the scribe's main responsibility was to assemble, to copy the scriptures for the people of Israel. Ezra and the other first scribes would copy scriptures, but then they would often make notes or comments on some of the passages that were more difficult to understand. Over the years, more and more interpretations were written in the copies of scripture. And now, in Jesus' day, there were actually more notes than there were direct statements of Scripture. Now, God, in His law, had told the people to observe certain ceremonial cleansings as part of their worship. But this has gone way beyond that now, in Jesus' day. The cleansing that God required was just a picture of His covenant with Israel. But now, the tradition of the elders made this ritual washing of hands the most important part of worship. And that's what they were complaining to Jesus about. The disciples were not violating the law of God. They were violating the tradition of these elders, these scribes. Now, if you go on and look at verses 6 through 8, you'll see that Jesus identified two problems that he was seeing. Quoting from Isaiah chapter 29, Jesus pointed out the first problem, a problem that existed in Israel and distracted them from real worship for hundreds of years. Jesus said, "These people honor me with their lips, but their heart is far from me." And Jesus pointed out that this is what makes them hypocrites. When we repeat meaningless rituals and traditions and words in worship, but our hearts are not changed, God sees that as hypocrisy. Then Jesus pointed out the second problem in verse 7. These people are teaching as doctrines of God the commandments of men. In other words, the interpretation of people, the traditions and beliefs of man were just as important in these people's minds as the words of God. What people say or teach about the Bible was just as important as what God said. And Jesus pointed out that's why their worship is meaningless or empty. So Jesus explained the problem And then he illustrated these two problems in reversed order in verses 8 through 23. First, he talks about the problem of relying on the wrong source of authority, people's ideas being just as important as God's. So he is illustrating what he just said in verses 7 and 8. What was the commandment of God? The commandment of God was the people were to honor, to respect their father and mother. What was the tradition they were following? They were replacing God's law with their own tradition. And they were saying you could reserve your finances and call it Corban, instead of helping your father and your mother when they needed it. Now this idea, this loophole, did not come from God. This was not God's idea. It was people's interpretation. Now, most of you have probably heard of Corban. Corban is a great Christian university here in the Northwest. And I'm sure that if Corban University had been around in Jesus' day, he probably would have mentioned it. But that's not really what Jesus was talking about. The word Corban just means, as he said, given to God or dedicated to God. And the real problem was that this interpretation developed by man had replaced the law of God. They were relying on the wrong source of authority. Then Jesus illustrated the second problem in verses 14 through 23. Now he goes on to talk about this problem of believing that you were corrupt or purified by eating or refusing to eat certain foods, by observing rituals. God had established some dietary laws too, but these dietary laws did not cleanse or defile a person. God's laws about what they were to eat and not eat were only an illustration of spiritual truth. That's all they were. So the Pharisees have elevated their view to say eating or avoiding certain foods is what cleanses you or defiles you before God. And ritual was important, not the heart in their minds. There's nothing spiritual about food or any other tradition. Jesus said, no, what comes out of your heart is what brings defilement or corruption. In verses 20 through 23. These behaviors that he mentioned are expressions of a wicked, godless heart. And worship that is going to make a difference must produce change in the heart. It is meaningless unless we invest our time and energy in worship that is not just a set of rituals or traditions. So I want to finish today by asking you to think about a couple of questions. Number one, is it possible that you have been relying on the wrong source of authority? Is it possible that the interpretation of some Bible teacher or some individual has become as important to you as the words of God? God has used men to help explain and help teach the Bible, to help us understand Scripture. But any of these men would tell you they're only men interpreting Scripture. None of them would want to be put on the same level as Scripture or the words of God. Second question, is it possible that you have fallen into the habit of just observing tradition in worship? Does worship change your heart? Is your heart or your mind, your way of looking at life, being changed by worship? I think that's what Jesus wanted us to understand in this exchange that he had in Mark chapter 7.